Through this panel, we would like to deepen public knowledge about the potential cost of conflict so that any future decision and discussion about military options is grounded in a rigorous assessment of the risk associated with it. I will invite each panelist to the stage to provide opening comments. Afterwards, the panelists will assemble up here. We'll have a chance to exchange questions and answers with all of you until about noon, and I will provide panelists with the opportunity to provide the last word in their closing comments. So with that, it is my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Scott Seaman, who focuses on Japan and the Korean Peninsula at the Eurasia Group, which is a leading global risk political analysis consultancy. Scott has held a variety of positions in government and the private sector, both in the United States and Japan. He also has the distinction of being an alumnus of both the University of Virginia and Duke, which will complicate, I think, his month ahead as both college basketball teams march forward in March Madness. But with that, I welcome Scott to the stage to talk about the potential economic impacts of conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I have to say, I went to Duke and UVA. I never attended a basketball game. So I have the dubious distinction of going to both schools, which are basketball powerhouses, but not having attended. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk today. As Ryan mentioned, I work at Eurasia Group. My primary job is to work with clients who are worried about political risk around the globe. I'm mainly focused on Japan and North Korea and South Korea, but in my role I also deal with a lot of pan-Asian issues, and certainly this is one of those today. I thought I would start by just talking about some of the impressions that I have gained by working with clients as this crisis has kind of developed over time. And I'll start by saying that this is definitely a classic fat tail risk that we're talking about. In other words, the chances of a military conflict actually occurring are, at least in my view, and I think many others share this view, is relatively remote. However, if it were to happen, it would have an incredibly damaging effect, not only in humanitarian terms, but economic terms, social terms, and everything else. But because of that, it's an incredibly difficult risk to price in. So clients that I talk to, they're always wondering, is this really going to happen? And if so, what do I need to worry about? But their primary question is what I just mentioned, is this going to happen? Because if it's not going to happen, they certainly don't want to take the time and energy and money required to try to build a business plan around it. I would say that they're worried about a number of different things. I can put them in big baskets. They're worried about their personnel on the ground. They're worried about their physical assets. They're worried about their financial assets. They're also worried about disruptions to supply chains and also about cyber attacks, which is something that is getting more and more attention as North Korea turns to that as a way to finance itself. But what's interesting is, as I said, firms and investors are struggling to find a way to incorporate their analysis of this risk in their actual decision making. And most of them have actually decided not to do so. And I just wanted to mention a survey that I came across because I wanted to find out more about what firms were actually doing to respond to this risk. And I found a couple of surveys, both from Reuters. One was in May of last year, and in this one, 87% of respondents, and this was a group of Japanese medium and large enterprises, 80% of them thought that the standoff would not lead to conflict. In other words, they didn't think that this was a highly significant risk. And only 10% were actually discussing what they would do in the event of a conflict. And 43% of those were talking about making new business continuity plans, and others were involved in planning to evacuate the peninsula, families and employees that they have there. Another survey in October 2017, only 24% of companies surveyed said that they felt the North Korean threat would have an impact on their operations or on business continuity planning. And of companies with business continuity plans, only 10% said that they were actually strengthening those plans or discussing doing so. The point I'm trying to make here is that people are extremely worried about this risk. Investors are worried and businesses are worried, those that have operations in South Korea, those that have investments there, and anyone else that does business in Asia or in the world is certainly looking at this as a significant risk. But because it's so difficult to price that risk in, the reaction has been relatively mild, and I wanted to talk just a little bit about that. 2017, despite all of this risk, was actually a phenomenally good year for South Korea. Now, you could argue that without this geopolitical risk, that things would have been better, but of course that's a counterfactual and really difficult to get your hands around. But let me just go through a few things that show how well the economy actually performed last year, despite all of this risk that we've been talking about. The main Kospi index began 2017 at a little over 2,000 and ended close to 2,500, meaning that if you were investing there, you made a 21% return. In 2016, the return was a little over 3%, and in 2015, it was a little over 2%. So, in addition to the geopolitical risk, you had a couple of other things that were happening that may have muted the effects of that. One was certainly the fact that we had an impeachment followed by a new president coming in, offering a fresh reform agenda, talking about cleaning up corruption, and that made a lot of investors and businesses more confident about the future for South Korea, despite the fact that they were facing this major threat in North Korea. Also, foreign investors were net purchasers of assets in Korea last year. Now, those net purchases were actually down from the year before, but it is remarkable that investors still continue to see South Korea as a place that they wanted to put their money. There were only 3 months in which they were net sellers. One was August, when, of course, we started to see a lot more risk around the idea that Kim Jong-un was talking about sending a missile maybe into waters near Guam. That risk continued into September, and so there were net selling activities by investors then, and then again in December, which was mainly profit share or profit taking at the end of the year. The won appreciated 14% in 2017. So, you know, on most of the major indices, the Korean economy performed quite well. This, of course, was also because the global economy as a whole was doing much better, and exports, which are such a large part of the Korean economy, were being pulled and really improving because of that. So a lot of the risks that we were trying to talk with clients about last year was actually difficult to put your finger on because of these other positive events that were happening around it. One other thing that I think is a large sea change that came as a result of this risk, and that's really the China-South Korea relationship. When I've been talking with Korean companies, for many, many years, as was the case with U.S. companies, China was seen as, you know, the Shangri-La, the market that they were going to go into, expand, make lots of money, and take advantage of not only their geographical closeness, but also their, you know, their political and social closeness to the Chinese. It was really seen as the market where they needed to be and expand. They are much, much more aware now of China as a source of political risk. And this is all around the dispute, the long-running dispute between Beijing and Seoul, when Beijing became very upset with Seoul's decision to deploy THAAD, and as a result started to retaliate against South Korean companies. And let me just talk briefly about that. South Korean investment in the first 7 months of last year into China declined 43%. So South Korean companies were definitely reacting to the idea that the business environment in China was not as welcome as it was in the past, and they were really drawing back on their investment plans. The Korean economy, lots of estimates as far as how much it actually lost as a result of the THAAD dispute, but I see the figure of $10 billion being thrown around a lot. Cosmetics were hit hard, entertainment, all of the K-pop that is normally so popular in China had a very difficult time remaining on television. Concerts were canceled. Consumer goods were hit very hard, and especially tourism. Tourism from China into South Korea really dropped off a cliff. And just as an example of that, the South Koreans were assuming or expecting that they would have around 200,000 Chinese visit the Olympics, and only 20,000 arrived, so that's only 10% of the original estimate. And of course, this is all of this geopolitical risk has prompted South Korea and Japan to take a harder look at their defense spending, and certainly my clients have been watching that very carefully because they want to be aware of what companies both in South Korea and in the US are likely to take advantage of what is likely to be a significant military buildup. Now moving just to the consequences. So what happened and what's happening now, and now what might happen if we actually have a conflict. There will be a huge sell-off of equities. Emerging markets will be hit especially hard, so South Korea obviously, but other countries in the region as well. Massive trade disruption. Just to give you an example of how important the sea and air routes are going through that area of the world. About $5 trillion worth of goods go through the South China Sea each year, and that's more than 1/3 of total global maritime traffic. So that's a huge amount of cargo and goods moving back and forth in an area that may become a war zone. 8 of the world's 15 biggest ports are in the region in terms of cargo volume, and 6 of the world's 15 busiest ports in terms of container traffic are also in the region. We would also expect a collapse of major supply chains, and in particular anything related to information and communication technologies, and that's mainly because South Korea has such a major role that it's playing in producing those sorts of things for the world. And I'm thinking in terms of semiconductors, wireless communication devices, flat panel displays, and application devices like tablets. Samsung in 2017 was responsible for 36% of NAND flash memory production in the world, and 45.6% of DRAM memory. A lot of South Korean companies have started to move their production outside of South Korea, but a lot of this high-tech production as well as the R&D is still located in South Korea, and of course all of that would be either severely damaged or certainly at severe risk in the event of a conflict. Of course, we can't forget about the fact that South Korea produces enormous amounts of cars and vehicle parts. So any supply chains in Asia or elsewhere that are connected to that would be severely damaged. I kind of think back to what happened with Japan after Fukushima, and all of the work that major companies had to do to repair their supply chains, and in many cases find alternatives. Massive capital outflows, regional currency depreciation, commodity prices across the world would really be fluttering because people would be struggling to figure out, well, what's the demand going to be and what's the supply going to be, because you'd really be getting hit on both of those, you'd be getting hit from both directions there. There would probably be a significant recession around the world. Very difficult to understand how long that would last, but maybe 2 years. And if you're talking about a global recession over the course of 2 years, you're talking about an incredible amount of capital that's lost and investment that stays where it is without being deployed. Property markets would get hit. And of course, you'd get into all of the problems associated with massive refugee flows. not only out of North Korea, but out of any of the other areas that are affected by a conflict. If you look towards the longer term consequences, again, these are all just estimates. You can find a wide range, but I've certainly heard that reunification could cost around $3 trillion. And you're talking about integrating two incredibly different economies, incredibly different populations. So it would take at least a generation to even get close to being able to economically integrate the two countries. You'd also have probably a major problem with unemployment in South Korea as it tries to absorb all of these refugees from the north. The real wild card for me, and I would love to be able to, one, find out if it exists, and two, be able to provide it to my clients, and that's, is there any sort of plan that the United States, South Korea, Japan, China, and other countries have made for who will be responsible for cleaning up the mess? Who will be maybe occupying parts of North Korea? Who will be in charge of rebuilding infrastructure? Who will take control of a lot of the resources that are in the region? All of those things will have enormous effects on investment. And when I'm talking about these consequences, obviously I'm talking way down the road, probably 20 to 30 years. But if you're a mining company, for example, you are thinking in those long timelines. Looking briefly on the bright side, if we can do that, we do have 25 million North Koreans who would be available to provide goods and services to the world at obviously a much, much higher level than they're doing now. And there are plenty of companies in South Korea and Japan and other places that would love eventually to be able to take advantage of that labor pool. Abundant natural resources. This is kind of the hidden treasure, aside from the nuclear weapons. The other hidden treasure that North Korea has is enormous wealth in natural resources. Ballpark figures suggest that maybe there are $10 trillion worth of minerals in North Korea. Coal, iron ore, zinc, copper, and a wide range also of rare earths. So if the North Koreans or anyone else is actually able to take advantage of those resources, that would definitely help pay for a lot of the reconstruction effort. And finally, I get a lot of questions about infrastructure. As everyone knows, China is very, very interested in building out its Belt and Road Initiative. South Korea also has its own plans for hopefully building out infrastructure in Northeast Asia, including through North Korea. And in the longer run, both the investment in that type of project and then the economic gains that come from it certainly would provide a bright spot much further down the road. And with that, Ryan, I will stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Our next speaker is Roberta Cohen. Roberta currently serves as co-chair emeritus of the Committee for Human Rights North Korea. Roberta's distinguished career has spanned the United Nations, the State Department, as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and as an author and academic. She's one of the world's leading experts on human rights and displaced persons. Today, we are fortunate to have her to examine the potential humanitarian consequences of conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be back at Brookings. It's one of my alma maters. Before commenting on the humanitarian cost and consequences of military action, which I was asked to do, let me first emphasize that it's important how we think about the people who will be affected. Need I even mention that the people over there have the same human worth, dignity, and value as the people over here? the comment attributed to our commander-in-chief that if there's a war, at least they will die over there, was made notwithstanding that the Republic of Korea is our ally, that its 51 million people will be affected, including some 240,000 American citizens living in Seoul, not to mention millions of Japanese that may be affected, and Japan is our ally as well. The principal driver of humanitarian crises worldwide is war. Unlike natural disasters, war rarely stays limited in scope, but can escalate and produce high numbers of casualties, injured people, and uprooted people who can become internally displaced, often on a massive scale, or flee across borders and become refugees. Most are desperate for food, medical care, clean water, shelter, and protection. The total number of forcibly displaced persons from war and violence today is more than 65 million. A war on the Korean Peninsula, even if not full scale, will add substantially to the world's totals because of the specific features of the Korean situation. First, both sides have advanced lethal weaponry, indeed weapons of mass destruction, pointing to the likelihood of rapid and enormous casualties. Even if North Korea were to use only conventional artillery and rockets against Seoul in a retaliatory strike, the number of civilians killed and injured could be in the tens of thousands as a minimum, rising to the hundreds of thousands. If North Korea used chemical weapons, and many believe it might, and possibly even biological weapons, the casualty rate will go even higher. And survivors will have to seek medical treatment for years thereafter. If in the worst case scenario, a nuclear weapon were to be used on Seoul and possibly Tokyo, there could be deaths in the low millions, plus additional fatalities and illnesses from radioactivity in the whole region. Were a tactical nuclear weapon to be deployed in North Korea, the damage might not necessarily be containable. So let's just say that the people over there are really going to suffer. Second, the density and location of South Korea's population points to a high death rate. Bruce Klingner mentioned nervousness in South Korea. South Korea should be nervous. Some 25 million people, half the population of the country, are concentrated in the Seoul greater metropolitan area, with 43,000 in each square mile, all within striking distance of the North's artillery, maybe 35 to 50 miles away. No amount of shelters, stockpiled food and medicines, and gas masks can fully shield a civilian population under direct military attack. And in an advanced economy like South Korea's, the damage to electric power and information systems could badly affect healthcare, food, clean water, and sanitation. The extent to which the population is prepared for a full-blown humanitarian emergency is not known, since too many drills or announcements could create panic. There will be a stay-put policy in Seoul, but the displacement of South Koreans can be expected. For the Americans and the Japanese in the country, totaling some 300,000, there are evacuation plans, but if one is realistic, how successful can they be? A third feature of the Korean situation is the rhetoric that has been used by the U.S. and North Korean heads of state, which seems to encourage attacks on civilians in a war situation. Threats to totally destroy North Korea and to unleash fire and fury suggest far more extensive military action than surgical strikes. Not to mention North Korea's threats to turn Seoul into a sea of fire and use nuclear weapons against American cities. Now, true, words can be bluster, but they also can cause miscalculation and create an environment in which unthinkable situations become more likely. Fourth is the humanitarian crisis already in North Korea. An estimated 70% of the North Korean population, 18 million people, are said by the UN to suffer from food insecurity and undernutrition. Some 15 million need access to basic health services, and 3.5 million access to clean water and proper sanitation. Recently, severe drought, flooding, and sanctions have exacerbated the situation. War will unquestionably cause further scarcities, so that people now living on the edge could fall over into starvation. We do not know whether the population today will be as accepting of hunger, disease, and death as it was during the Great Famine of the 90s. We may have in North Korea what the UN calls a complex emergency, where authority, local or central, breaks down and international involvement becomes necessary. Fifth, a refugee emergency. Sizable, even massive flows from North Korea can be expected if there is escalating conflict and food scarcity, with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands fleeing principally to China and ultimately to South Korea, with smaller numbers to Japan, Russia, and other countries. Sometimes the 1 million figure is used, but often those who do so overlook the barriers to refugee flows, such as landmines at the DMZ, a possible Chinese closure of part of its border, military strikes, tunnels overrun with soldiers. The contingency plans of the US, South Korea, and China are reported to all give priority to averting refugee flows by restoring order quickly and helping people survive where they are. This, of course, presumes troops on the ground, and it also presumes collaboration among the US, South Korea, and China in the event of turmoil. China is reportedly building refugee camps near its border and also planning special zones in North Korea for internally displaced persons, IDPs, whose numbers will no doubt exceed those of refugees. Unique to the Korean context is that refugee flows could actually be a catalyst for the first stage of Korean unification. South Korea is legally and politically bound to allow in North Koreans, considering them its citizens. However, if South Korea is under attack and endures a difficult post-conflict recovery, it may not be in a position to bring in large numbers, at least not immediately. Managing migration will become a pressing issue, and UNHCR, IOM, and other agencies may have to be called in to promote wider burden sharing. Finally, let's turn to the obligation of the US military to give high priority to protecting civilians during hostilities. From the humanitarian perspective, the challenging issues, even sore points, that usually arise include: one, collateral damage, the euphemism for civilian casualties and destruction of homes, hospitals, and even aid convoys. Second, the usage of weapons like cluster bombs in Afghanistan that pose a threat to the civilian population. Three, humanitarian pauses and coordination between airstrikes and food deliveries. Let me also draw attention to a fourth, peculiar to North Korea, its notorious political prison camps with some 120,000 plus inmates. The military will need to have a map of these camps so as not to rain down fire on prisoners who already suffer from the worst malnutrition, disease, and abuse in the country. The largest camp, number 16, is just 2.5 kilometers away from Punggye-ri nuclear site, a possible military target. Furthermore, if U.S. and allied military forces are on the ground and it were militarily feasible, there's the question of taking over the prison camps and securing entry to them for humanitarian actors. The dismantlement of the camps has long been a goal of the United States and of the international community. In closing, let me underscore that a war initiated by the United States will give the Trump administration the obligation to foot the humanitarian costs, and also a major part of the recovery. To this end, cooperation with the international humanitarian system will be essential rather than slashing their budgets. Humanitarian and development actors will be better accepted by the local population than foreign forces and have expertise with reconstruction and recovery. Now, joint pre-planning will be a challenge since the humanitarian actors are often reluctant to become involved in planning for a war as opposed to a natural disaster. But joint strategizing could go a long way toward ensuring that the humanitarian consequences of military strategy are more easily anticipated and better dealt with. Recently, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights identified the humanitarian and human rights crises around the world and called them some of the most prolific slaughterhouses of humans in recent times. Let us hope that Korea, both North and South, can be spared the agony of joining that list. Thank you.
Roberta, thank you for that sobering presentation. Our next speaker is Mara Carlin. Mara is a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings, in addition to being a professor across the street at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Mara previously served in the Pentagon, where she advised 5 secretaries of defense on issues relating to strategic planning, defense budgeting, and future wars. In her last role at the Pentagon, Mara was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, where she played a key role in guiding the evolving development of the U.S. military. Today, Mara will examine defense and logistical issues of a military operation on the Korean Peninsula. Mara, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all very much for having me today. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time offering up some of the questions that the Pentagon is probably having swim in its brain these days as it thinks about what a conflict with North Korea might involve and what it might look like. It's important, however, when you do this, that you think a little bit about the U.S. way of war. And there's 2 key principles I want to make sure that you're thinking about. Number 1, the U.S. military fights away games. So while there are 28,500 U.S. military personnel in South Korea, and while there is a substantial U.S. military presence and posture across the Asia-Pacific, these are away games, and in the event of a conflict, these numbers will be rather insufficient. The second key principle to be aware of is that because of these away games, the U.S. military has to be able to get anywhere at any time under any circumstances. And as you think about what such a conflict looks like, you'll realize that much of that might be impeded. The U.S. military has been at war for the longest period of time in its history, for 16 plus years. And the types of wars it has been fighting are profoundly different than the conversation we are having today. That's important because it has a tactical, operational, and strategic impact on what you will ask your U.S. military to be able to do and to do successfully. This is a military that has focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, a military with lots of experience in fighting terrorists and insurgents, a military that has spent a lot of time learning Arabic and Pashto and Dari. Moreover, this is a military, and I would argue an American public, that has lost the ability to conceptualize what big wars look like. And we are talking about big war. I spent all morning teaching my students across the street about World War II. And if you want an analogy, it should not be the last 15, 16 years of war. It should be much, much bigger in scope. So the Pentagon, if it is being asked these questions about conceptualizing how to actually plan for this sort of war, is going to think about the different types of wars it has been preparing for to date. It will also be thinking about how orthogonal this sort of conflict will be to the strategy it has just released. So only a few weeks ago, also across the street, Secretary Mattis put out his national defense strategy. And the focus is on great power competition, great power rivalry. It looks at Russia and it looks at China, and it says this is the future, dealing with these sorts of challenges. And it emphasizes how important it is to not let that future be dragged down by the ankle biter that is the Middle East. You could say that a conflict in North Korea would be a perfect way to kill, or at a minimum, neutralize that national defense strategy. Let's say, nevertheless, though, one wants to think about what questions arise for a conflict. So the first thing the Pentagon will say is, what's the end state we're after? What are the goals that we are trying to achieve? And while these are not mutually exclusive, there could be a handful of them, like deterring future tests, destroying the nuclear capabilities, or regime change. So, based on whatever end states are being given to the Defense Department, it will then try to plan out operationally how do you actually fight and win and achieve whatever these objectives are. So let's say it's the first one. Let's say it's what's known as a preventative attack against a facility, for example. So the Pentagon will think operationally, how do I best do this? You can do this by air, for example. You might use stealth capabilities like F-22s or F-35s. You could do this by sea, for example, using land attack cruise missiles. To do so effectively, you might have to jam command and control in North Korea. You might also have to harm or potentially destroy air defenses. Now, of course, you have the challenge that all of this may be perceived by North Korea as not merely a preventative strike. But operationally, that's how you would do it. Let's say, in particular, this preventative strike would want to be over, say, a missile launch site. You would have the challenge of finding said site. Moreover, thinking through which site you actually want to hit. Because inconveniently, it turns out many of these are near the border with China. That makes it a little more complicated. There is an operational objective, no doubt. Sometimes that cannot be terribly consonant with a strategic objective. The U.S. military will be thinking about how to protect its bases in Japan, in Guam, in Hawaii, but of course in South Korea. So let's say it's given the end state of a much more expansive one. Let's say the Pentagon is given the end state of destroying nuclear capabilities or even regime change. It will think about, how do I know if I've gotten everything I need to get? It will no doubt be planning a profound and substantial ground invasion every assessment on this topic shows the numbers for a ground invasion will be substantially more than you have seen in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is why the last 15 plus years of war are terrible analogies for understanding what a conflict like this would look like. It would involve shipping over months troops and tanks and armored personnel carriers and bombers and fighter jets and helicopters. Estimates are it would take, at a minimum, 2 months or so for all of this material to arrive. Obviously, this does not happen in a vacuum. All of us who remember the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War remember watching on our televisions every night the flow of men and material to the Middle East. One would have to assume that such a logistical train would be pretty severely impeded. Other questions the Pentagon will be thinking about. As this conflict erupts, what will the impact of conventional artillery be? Almost surely tens of thousands of casualties. Will chemical and biological weapons be used? That is an asymmetric advantage that the North Koreans have. They could kill many, many people, but perhaps just as importantly, they could cause profound panic. And it's worth remembering when we look at the Iraq War that this was a very big worry. It was one of the few worries, it turns out, that did not come to fruition, but would have markedly changed what that conflict looks like. The Pentagon will be thinking about what's known as a NEO, a non-combatant evacuation. Effectively, the U.S. military has a bit of an obligation to the Americans that are in the region, and specifically that are in South Korea, which is to get them out. This could be about 300,000 people. I ran the largest NEO that the Pentagon has ever had to do back in 2006 during the Israel-Hezbollah war. That involved 15,000 people. It was pretty slow. At one stage, we literally sent a cruise ship to try to take people out of Lebanon. And importantly, at the time, Lebanon was being attacked by a very close U.S. partner, Israel. So we were able to have very frank communications with the attacker. And even then, it was difficult and unwieldy and slow. And we faced a whole lot of criticism. That's 15,000 versus 300,000. Other questions the Pentagon will be thinking about: the Chinese, of course, a topic that no doubt has been addressed pretty substantially earlier today. What are they willing to do? What are their interests? Are they prioritizing the same thing we are prioritizing, which is probably those nuclear weapons? And what are the South Koreans thinking? How expansive do they think this conflict should be? Where do our interests diverge? The Pentagon will be thinking about stabilization and reconstruction. So we have recently seen a city destroyed by ISIS, Mosul. Spent time in Mosul, city blocks absolutely destroyed, reminiscent of World War II battles. This is a city of about 660,000 people, and assessments are that it'll take tens of billions of dollars to rebuild. Seoul is 9.8 million people. So you can think about those numbers. And that's stabilization and reconstruction of South Korea, not North Korea. That's an entirely different ballgame. And of course, the penultimate question that the Pentagon will be asking itself is, what about nuclear weapons? Do we need to use them? And there are arguments that in this conflict, operationally, the Pentagon will have an easier job satisfying some of its objectives if it chooses to use nuclear weapons. It will be more effective in some ways, but that's operationally. Strategically, obviously, the cost would be profound for nuclear weapons to only be used again by the United States. Obviously, that doesn't get into the question of what about North Korea and to the extent to which they choose to do so. So let me conclude by saying this. On Saturday, I'm taking 45 students and faculty to South Korea. We've been studying the Korean War, the historic one, for the last few months. And we're going to go and walk around and think about this conflict. And so in preparing for this war, I've been spending a lot of time in archives. And I have been struck by how wrong the United States was, time and time again, in understanding that conflict. The role of the Chinese, in particular, shocking, completely unexpected when you read the declassified materials, right? It's very clear Truman's administration says the Chinese aren't going to get involved. They don't need to do so. They have other things on their priority list. Moreover, I'm struck by how wrong the U.S. leadership is about how quickly this conflict would end. MacArthur pledges to Truman this conflict will end by Christmas. The U.S. troops in South Korea have a massive, debaucherous almost Thanksgiving, where they go overboard because the conflict is about to end. And yet we're sitting here in 2018, and the U.S. military is still in South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Our last speaker in this panel is my good friend, Laura Rosenberger. Laura is the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Prior to joining the German Marshall Fund, Laura held a variety of national security positions at the State Department and the National Security Council, including as the National Security Council Director for Korea and China, and as Tony Blinken's Chief of Staff. Laura also was Foreign Policy Advisor to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Today, she will examine the impact of a military operation on the Korean Peninsula for America's alliance relationships, its regional standing, and its global standing.
Thanks, Ryan. Ryan forgot to mention one of the biggest distinctions of my career, which was having the privilege of sharing an office, a very teeny tiny one in the executive office building when we were both at the NSC together. So thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. You've heard a lot from my co-panelists here this morning about the economic, humanitarian, and military costs and consequences of a U.S.-initiated conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But any move would also come with significant geostrategic consequences. One of the most important aspects of our policy towards North Korea has been presenting a united front among our allies, partners like China and Russia, and the broader international community. And given different interests at play, this has not always been easy. But to its credit, the Trump administration has marshaled international support, in particular for significant new sanctions on North Korea. But what would a military conflict initiated by the United States do to that unified international support? Could it be undertaken in a way that garnered support from others? Or would it rather serve to divide consensus and undermine international pressure? As we heard in the first panel this morning, as we head towards a summit between Trump and Kim, there's a chance at real diplomacy. But that could be followed by failure at the table. Could that provide support from others for military action? That would require failure being squarely blamed on North Korea, with others believing diplomacy has truly run its course. But as we've seen from previous episodes of negotiation, North Korea is a master at turning the idea of continuing talks alone as leverage in and of itself, creating pressure to maintain talks and finding a way to point the finger at the United States. This means that any military conflict could well divide the international community, divide that very support that is so essential for any real approach to dealing with North Korea. And if the administration were to pursue a bloody nose option, that would presumably depend on either pressure or diplomacy in the aftermath of a strike in order to constrain North Korean retaliatory action and compel it to denuclearize. Others have gotten into the pitfalls of such a move. I will let their comments speak because they've done so eloquently. But let me turn to the specific consequences that I see for our alliances, for our regional standing, and for geopolitical implications of a U.S.-initiated conflict on the Korean Peninsula. As we've heard from other panelists this morning, as both the geographically nearest neighbor and a critical ally in the Joint Forces Command for the Korean Peninsula, the ROK would be both the most critical to have on board for any strike on the north and also have the most at stake. The The Moon administration has made clear its opposition to a U.S.-initiated military action on the Korean Peninsula, going so far as at the National Assembly in November, Moon Jae-in saying, quote, "No military action on the Korean Peninsula will be undertaken without the prior consent of the Republic of Korea." Now, there's real questions, and in fact, it doesn't appear that such a veto power exists in the U.S.-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty. But that reality notwithstanding, this is the position of the Moon administration. Going into such a conflict with the division in the alliance would carry serious consequences, not just for our ability to carry out any operation itself, as Mara so eloquently laid out, but would have real consequences for the future of the alliance. And as many in this room know, part of Kim Jong-un's strategy has actually been trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and ROK, so-called decoupling. A preventive strike against North Korea without the ROK on board could do Kim Jong-un's work for him. This would also further undermine deterrence in the future. But the challenges would not just be with respect to a conflict in itself, but the day after. As we heard from Roberta, South Korea would be critical to any planning for the day after, for reconstruction, for stabilization. The day after has always been one of the most sensitive topics in any conversations between the United States and the ROK. This is an incredibly sensitive topic domestically. And in ROK minds, the peninsula is theirs to make decisions about. And they have resisted in the past any idea of the U.S., China, or international organizations having a role. While this may seem unrealistic, this is going to require serious diplomacy and very close ties between the U.S. and our South Korean allies to navigate these treacherous waters. Doing so while going into a conflict with a divided alliance would make that challenge even more difficult. We also heard this morning about tensions that exist in the U.S.-Japan alliance, worsened, of course, by the recent announcement on tariffs. The question of how Japan is seeing Trump-Kim diplomacy, I think, could really dictate how Japan would posture on any potential strike on the North initiated by the United States. But I think that we should bear in mind very clearly that Japan would also be likely on the receiving end of any retaliation from the North and have a significant stake in this game. Doing so without close alignment between Tokyo would be a folly at best. And trilateral coordination between the ROK, Japan, and the United States would be essential both during and in the wake of a military conflict. We know that ROK-Japan relations have never been easy, but they have gone backwards in the past year, in part, in my view, due to a decision by this administration that is not a priority in the region. But going in without a clear trilateral front would also do damage not only to our ability to carry out such an operation, but to our clear standing with our allies going forward. More broadly, I want to cite one of my colleagues, Mika Ouyang, who is the Vice President for National Security at the organization Third Way, who has commented on the importance of the United States as a force for stability in the region. That has been one of the biggest underpinnings of our power, our staying power, our attractiveness to others in the region. A U.S.-initiated military strike would undermine that, doing significant damage to our ability to advance U.S. interests and project U.S. security. It comes at a time when China is trying to assert greater leadership in the region as well, particularly as the U.S. has pulled back in certain ways. And if the U.S. becomes seen as an aggressor in the region, this gives even greater opening for China to show its way forward to others. But China has also wanted nothing more than to see a weakening of alliances, and any fraying of the alliances in the wake of a military conflict would play directly into Chinese hands. So while China may have great trepidation and, in fact, serious concerns about any U.S.-initiated military strike on the peninsula, in the long run, this could actually do some of Beijing's work for it as well, sending some into Chinese arms. And it could undercut the administration's efforts to create distance between Beijing and Pyongyang. Of course, there is, as we heard, the potential for direct U.S.-China conflict in the course of any U.S.-initiated military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And it stands to reason that Russia could potentially stand with China in any such conflict. And just as China is reasserting its role in the region, we see Russia reasserting itself as well. Russia has made known its interest in the Korean Peninsula through a number of ways. Some of it is through its very clear statements about the issue. Some of it is by backfilling some of the things that China has cut off in terms of trade, stepping in to help their North Korean friends. I agree as well. I can't remember who commented earlier that in some ways a Putin play here in terms of the Trump-Kim summit is very possible. I think quite dangerous, actually. We saw, of course, in the course of USRRK joint exercises last fall, Russia fly 2 Bear bombers, strategic bombers, right through that exercise, sending a very clear signal of Russia's interest in the peninsula. And of course, most recently during the Olympics, Russia apparently conducted a cyber attack that it did under a false flag, trying to have it attributed to North Korea, almost seeming to encourage some kind of conflict. So again, when we look at the strategic landscape of the region, a conflict initiated by the United States could well help Russia with its own goal of reestablishing some of its interests in the region. Of course, the U.S. has other allies in the region. Australia has said it would come to the aid of the U.S. if North Korea was attacked. It would come to the aid of the U.S. if North Korea attacked. But its posture if the U.S. were to launch a first strike isn't clear. New Zealand has actually stated that it would only engage in some assistance if a strike on the Korean Peninsula received backing from the UN Security Council. But it's not just our standing in the region that's at stake here. This all comes at a time when the U.S. seems to be retreating from the global stage, creating unneeded conflict over tariffs, trade, linking economic interests to strategic interests across the European landscape. I just actually came back from Brussels over the weekend and had a lot of conversations with European colleagues about North Korea. This is an issue that has generally ranked lower on the priority list for our European colleagues. They've felt less directly at stake. This also comes at a time when the United States is trying to renegotiate the Iran deal, getting our European allies on board with new revised terms to that deal. So adding another piece of friction in that line of communication seems like it would make getting European support for a U.S.-initiated strike on the Korean Peninsula difficult at best. In fact, German Chancellor Merkel has made clear that she does, quote, not see a military solution to this conflict. Unnamed UK officials have said they wouldn't support a U.S. military strike. I think, in fact, while it may seem separate, how the question of whether the Trump administration stands up to support the UK in the wake of an apparent Russian chemical weapons attack on UK soil, one that NATO has said already that it believes the alliance should stand together in the face of. If the U.S. does not stand with the UK in the face of this, how we can expect the UK to stand with us in the face of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula is a great mystery to me. So it seems like any U.S. action to initiate a strike on the Korean Peninsula would most likely be go it alone. And that, I believe, would further isolate the United States and undermine our ability to advance other interests. The national security strategy released by this administration has said that a return to great power competition with China and Russia is central to U.S. national security. But undertaking this kind of action would cut directly at the core of that. The U.S., as Mara mentioned, is also still fighting 2 missions in the Middle East. We have troops in Afghanistan, and we continue to fight the counter-ISIS mission. And again, we see a resurgent Russian threat in Europe. Given the resources required for any conflict on the Korean Peninsula, that would directly undermine our ability to protect those other U.S. national security interests. And it's not just the resources required for military action itself, but as we heard from Roberta and from Mara, it's the significant attention and resources that would be required for reconstruction for many years. And at a time when the image of the U.S. is declining around the world, according to polls, a preventive war on North Korea would likely harden attitudes against the United States, making it harder to accomplish our goals across the board and creating greater space for our adversaries. In sum, it's hard for me to think of a more damaging move for U.S. alliances, our regional standing, and our geopolitical position than a U.S.-initiated military action, a war of choice, against North Korea that is not backed by our partners and allies. Nothing here means that the United States should not defend itself if it or its allies are facing an imminent threat. In fact, we must. But a war of choice would do damage to the United States well beyond the peninsula. We need to keep the focus on North Korea as the aggressor. The minute we become the aggressor, we lose the very international support that is necessary to address the North Korea challenge itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your presentations this morning. I want to give the audience as much time as possible to weigh in and offer their views, their questions to you. But before doing so, I'd like to use my prerogative as a moderator to ask one question. And that is, when we listen to our friends in the administration talk about the option of a limited military strike, they indicate that limited action could be useful for shaking Kim Jong-un's confidence, that the United States will be reluctant to use force, and that if messaged appropriately, a limited strike could be useful, in part because Kim Jong-un would be too scared to respond because the risk of responding could invite escalation that could lead to his demise. Why is that argument wrong?
I'm happy to jump in quickly. So to me, it's in part about this question of being united or not, and how a conflict comes about, how a strike were to come about. Shaking his confidence would also require having a plan on the back end of this. What is the plan for both deterring action, retaliatory action by the North, and what is the plan for then putting things on a track towards a diplomatic outcome, towards negotiations? And if a bloody nose strike, so-called bloody nose strike, were undertaken without the larger context for that to be successful, I don't see how it could possibly have the outcome that they're seeking.
I think that the idea that Kim Jong-un will do nothing and will not retaliate in some way and will just sort of take it on the chin, so to speak, is tremendously risky. We don't really know that. And who's at risk? Again, we get to over there. The South Koreans are. So it's quite a risk. Wars don't usually begin with one strike here and then nothing happens. There's a way that they connect and escalate to other military actions. It's very hard to have the luxury of having that kind of even vision of this situation. And also with a government in North Korea where they have been quite cunning, quite shrewd, and quite brutal. And I think that it was a message to everyone when the half-brother was assassinated by nerve agents in the full airport in Kuala Lumpur. It wasn't just an internal domestic way of dealing with his half-brother and a political dispute, but it was also a message to everyone else that they are capable and willing of doing something as risky as that and using chemical weapons for their own purposes.
just add, it's really hard to conceive of a circumstance under which this happens. I think Laura and Roberta are spot on. There's just so many caveats. The only analogy I can think of is when the Israelis hit the covert nuclear reactor in Syria back in 2007. And if you recall, this was a nuclear reactor, had been developed covertly thanks to the North Koreans, so it brings us back, of course, to the topic at hand. And the Syrians did not react. This would have been the closest example to kind of a bloody nose strike. So why didn't they, and why are these analogies so different? First of all, you had interlocutors speaking with the Assad regime immediately after the strike to explain what had happened and why. Second of all, you had an Assad regime that had the choice whether or not to advertise this, because it was actually quite embarrassing. It had been done quietly under cover of night and dawn, and it would have been rather embarrassing to imagine it. So the analogy also doesn't work in that regard. And thirdly, and most importantly, the Assad regime does not bank on being a nuclear power. It is not the way that it has advertised itself to the world, which is exactly what we have seen in Pyongyang.
I'd also like to know, what is it that is going to be struck when that argument is made?
I'm not in a position to offer a response to.
I should note, if I can add to that good point, this decision by the Israelis had involved 8 months of extremely close discussions with the United States. Probably one of the tightest interagency process that the U.S. government has ever seen. I don't think we have a whole lot of examples in this administration of that sort of close collaboration among different agencies in Washington and that sort of trust.
One more point on this. I think Roberta's point is really important to the extent that whether or not all of the kinds of things we would need to hit are all co-located, whether or not we know where all of those things are, I think is a very large question mark, number one. But number two, shaking Kim out of whatever, shaking him into realizing the consequences, would require that Kim be a rational actor. Now, I believe Kim is rational. This administration has seemed to cast doubt on whether Kim Jong-un is a rational actor. They have made the case that he cannot be deterred, in part because he abuses his people, he's a dictator who's a narcissist, he's irrational. How you can argue that you will get a rational outcome from a man you have decided is irrational doesn't really hold up to logic. Now, again, I personally believe he is rational, but if that is their logic train, it falls apart somewhere.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like to invite questions from the audience. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time.
My name is Stephen Shore. To follow up on this, how is any nation whose facility is attacked to know that the attack is itself limited and not part of the first of a sequence? And my second question is, didn't the Japanese intend the attack on Pearl Harbor to be a limited strike?
I'll take the second one. Absolutely. The Japanese they conducted the attack under the view that America would be so perturbed that we would therefore not get involved in the Pacific. Literally the exact opposite happened.
Why don't we take 1 or 2 more questions, then we'll bring the panel in to react to them. Please.
Hi, my name is Grace Kong, and I'm a lawyer who focuses on public international law and human rights. My question is to the point that people have made that having a meeting between Kim and Trump in itself is a victory for Kim's legitimacy. I would like to ask what if Trump told Kim in this meeting that he was actually illegitimate because of his crimes against humanity and other gross violations of human rights? True, he would certainly not be very happy with that. But in terms of that leading into anything that would cause death, isn't that a leap because he actually has a stronger incentive to keep the talks going. So I don't understand why the human rights aspect is not being discussed all within the same conversation and should be raised by Trump with Kim.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take one more question? Sumi?
I have a question for Mara, a specific question about just logistics. If you can talk a little bit more about non-combatant evacuation. You brought up the Israeli situation. I think last time was in Saigon, was like 60,000 people we tried to evacuate. How does, in any given time, there's 230, 240,000 Americans in South Korea. So how would that even look like? I can't even begin to understand how it works. So if you could just shed a little bit of light on that would be great.
Great.
So, since the mic is right here.
Yeah.
So my question is for, this panel has been really powerful and pitch perfect in the presentations. And I found the human rights, the humanitarian issue and the alliance and strategic and the defense, the vocabulary is very compelling to me and to probably most of the people in the room. But it's the vocabulary of economics that I think resonates the most. I'm not sure what the question is, but how would you use that vocabulary of the economic impacts of a Korean Peninsula war? How do you explain the resilience of the South Korean economy, even amid the locked and loaded episode, and how and what is going to eat away at that resilience?
Thank you. Why don't we start at the start and work our way through these questions to give Scott a second to formulate his thoughts. The first question, how would a country know a limited strike is limited? Should human rights be integrated into discussions about denuclearization? How would NEO happen in practice? And how do we talk about the vocabulary of economics and juxtapose it against the economic growth that South Korea has experienced in the past year? Do you want to start, Roberta?
I'll certainly start with the human rights question.
Sure.
I just want to say from the outset that human rights can be, but is not a weapon. And that's how it's increasingly thought of in all of this, as some kind of weapon you hit the other side with, or something for megaphone diplomacy. And I find that, as somebody who's been involved with human rights for all my career, really, not something that I would celebrate. Human rights is a serious issue, and if you were to break it down even here, what are the issues on the table, really? The first one would be the Americans who are in prison in North Korea right now. There are 3. There are 6 South Koreans, I believe. Secondly, was an issue that was mentioned in the first panel, the reunification of families. And again, even here, this is a serious issue. The reunification meetings that have taken place in the past, if you really look at them, the money under the table, the surveillance over them, having to be in North Korea, there are a whole series of parts of those meetings that I would not think even should be graced. I mean, this is not how a reunification between family members should be held. So this is something to talk about. Third is the access to the country of the humanitarian actors, even on the ground. They have their programs. Their access is so constrained by so many different compromises that are made. This is something really to discuss in terms of whether humanitarian aid is reaching the people it's supposed to, the aid that is going through. And then there's the question of the release from prison camps of families who've been put there with the prisoners and the prison camps themselves. And is this just to upset the North Koreans that it's raised? No. Hundreds of thousands of people are said to have died in these prison camps since they began. It's one of the atrocities of the world. It's something that should interfere with normalization of relations with North Korea. It's something that has to be on the table. Now, how it's done is very important. I do not think that you walk into a room and immediately announce, attack North Korea for doing this or doing that. I don't think that's a serious use of the human rights issues that need to be discussed. I think that one would have to find, and I hope there's the skill in that government, to see human rights as serious issues that can be broken down and negotiated. And the North Koreans do actually respond. If they want something, they do have in the past, and I'm not thinking of this outrageous warm beer case, but of other cases where Americans have been released. I am thinking of reports of, and also persons who were abducted by Japan were released. There are things North Korea can do. There are even reports that aren't confirmed about whether or not in some of the detention facilities or in the prisons there is even some restraint because of fear of courts and justice concerns. So I think that the issue should be thought about seriously, worked out how this gets introduced in discussions with North Korea, which will deal with the military, which will deal with strategic, will deal with nuclear, which will deal with economics, and should also deal with information flows, which is part of human rights as well, allowing in information and bringing out information. This is both critical to nuclear talks with verification and monitoring, as well as it is to any kind of human rights discussions about information flows, and getting to these issues in a really sophisticated way. And I think that that is what is so missing in everything I hear about how human rights is being dealt with currently in this North Korea and U.S. relationship.
Laura, is there any of the 4 questions you'd like to pick up?
Yeah, a couple quick thoughts. One, it's hard for me to really add much to Roberta's extraordinarily eloquent answer on the human rights piece. Let me just add that I do hope that in the course of negotiations with North Korea, that human rights would be raised. I do think that's very important. I personally, given the president's own seeming lack of value of human rights as an issue that the United States should care about, I have my doubts about whether he would personally be willing to do that with Kim Jong-un, but I would love nothing more than to be proven wrong on that point, but having it done in a way that Roberta offers, not in a sort of weaponized way. The other point I just wanted to touch on for a moment, and I'm going to put on my campaign hat that I wore for a little while, as Ryan mentioned, which is thinking about how do we message foreign policy to the American people, as Jung was kind of getting at here. And as Ryan mentioned, I was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor. What I can tell you is the vast majority of American voters don't really care a whole lot about foreign policy when you talk about it in abstract terms. One of the things we haven't really talked about today is that most analysts and lawyers believe that any U.S. military action on the Korean Peninsula would require an authorization for the use of military force from Congress. That is something that certain people in the administration have apparently been trying to find a workaround for, but assuming that it does require a vote in Congress to authorize the use of military force, the voices of the American people will be extraordinarily important in letting their members of Congress know what they think about pursuing such a conflict. And I do think that the way we can actually best convey the consequences of this kind of action to the American people is through the economic argument. And I will leave it to Scott to actually speak to how we best make that case in terms that resonate. But I do think that that's a really important point.
Thank you. Scott?
So just to make sure I understand your question, it's...
I'm not sure if I understood my question. Laura put it so much better than I ever could.
So you know, how do we inject the economic angle into this discussion?
It resonates more with this administration and, as Laura
Right,
mentioned,
right.
with the people, right?
So you know, my sense, I've been looking at the Chorus FDA quite a bit too, and looking at the the reaction in the United States, industry associations, individual companies. And last year it was pretty quiet. I think a lot of companies were, one, surprised that they were looking at Trump in the presidency and didn't have maybe a cadre of lobbyists that was really equipped to gain quick access to his administration, because these were new people that were being brought in and they were not the same people. So a lot of the business community, I think, was relatively quiet. I think that's changing now. I think as Chorus lumbers along, that more and more businesses are getting direct access to policymakers, including the White House. Definitely the industry associations, I've seen much more activity that they're taking to really counter some of the claims that people in the administration are making about the the worth of the Chorus FTA and who's responsible for the trade deficit, things like that. So I think it's getting better, but I think when you start talking about war, obviously that takes center stage. The strategic angles, the military considerations, all of that obviously takes center stage. And it takes more time for the economic actors to wrap their brains around it. And as I said, it's incredibly difficult to price in. I would argue that a major earthquake in the Kanto region of Japan under Tokyo is easier to price in, because you know it's going to happen, right? You don't know when, but it will happen at some point. With North Korea, it would be more devastating, but you don't know if it's actually going to happen. So economic actors are trying, as I said, to figure out how much money and time and energy do they invest in planning and putting in place a strategy for dealing with something that may never happen. But definitely, I think the stories around the supply chains, all of the U.S. companies that would be devastated by not being able to get what they get from Samsung, high-end batteries, all the chips that go into everything, and seventh largest exporter in the world, 11th largest economy in the world. So not something you want to lose as part of the global economy. So I think it will get better. I'm hoping that Chorus is maybe a turning point, and the administration takes an approach to that really does highlight the benefit of the economic relationship, and that will then be something they can put alongside whatever Trump wants to do with North Korea.
So there are 3 steps if you want to do a non-combatant evacuation. Number 1 is you have to figure out your numbers. The embassy will usually be the best source of this, because the embassy generally has a decent amount of contact with Americans, assuming they've registered with the embassy. It's quite possible that they have not. I can tell you 15,000, the number evacuated in that NEO that I mentioned from 2006, was nowhere near the initial guesses whatsoever. We had heard a few thousand at best. So number 1 is you have to figure out what your numbers are. Number 2, you have to actually figure out, how do you contact all these people, right? Especially if you're in circumstances of impeded communications. Your email's not going to be working terribly well. Your Wi-Fi will probably have some trouble. But how do you actually reach them and figure out, do they want to leave? Where are they? And how do you maintain that contact as they are making their way to wherever you want them to? So you have to figure out your numbers. You have to figure out how you're going to contact them. And then you have, of course, the penultimate question of, how are you actually going to do this? How will you get them out? So one option is to say, safe passage isn't going to happen. We're not going to be able to negotiate with the North Koreans a way in which they will allow, literally hundreds of thousands of Americans to get to ports so that they can leave safely. In the case of the 2006 NEO, we literally had U.S. military personnel in Israel co-located with Israeli personnel looking at maps saying, that's our convoy, that's not our convoy. And under those circumstances, it was very slow, and everyone got out safely. So it is quite conceivable that you might say safe passage isn't possible, and instead go find your way to a bunker, Hope there's not too much fallout, either from missiles or from radioactivity, you name it. But let's say you decide, no, we actually need some sort of safer passage. We need to get people out. Because of the numbers you're looking at, you'd probably go for ships, and you'd probably try to figure out what ships are in the area, what ships can get there quickly, just because taking people out by air, C-130s are probably your best option, but those would be, you just wouldn't be able to carry that many. So that would kind of be the balance that you would be thinking about. I hope it's pretty clear that this is hideous and complicated, and it is really hard to conjure up what any sort of effective NEO would look like. So my advice for anyone would probably be, don't try to participate in the NEO and find a place underground to be for as long as you can.
Thank you. That's why I asked the question. As a argument, I think this will resonate. You are really risking American lives, even if you're talking about people over there. We're talking about 230,000 American lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. We'll go to this gentleman here, and then we'll give our panelists a chance for final thoughts.
Thank you again. Mitsuo Nakai is my name, Heritage Foundation. What Japan can do for South Korea, or should do, as much as the Japanese Constitution allows it, because it would have to be defensive facts involved. A, in terms of diplomacy. B, in terms of the war broke out. Not easy question, but I'd like to hear some of that.
Thank you very much. This is your chance for parting shots. If you'd like to address the question, you're welcome to. If you'd like to offer your own views, you're welcome to as well. But Mara, if it's all right, we'll start with you this time and work our way this way.
Sure. At least on the Japan front, per the NEO discussion I was just having, at a minimum, having Japan being a place that would welcome American non-combatants that are evacuated would be really, really important, and finding a way to take care of them, because that's probably the closest place that you would take them. Obviously, that would assume Japan is not under a direct threat, which may not be a great assumption to have. I would just wrap up, actually, if I could foot stomp a point Laura made earlier about this authorization of use of military force. I think is really worth giving some serious thought to. I mean, the U.S. military has been at war for about 16 years or so, and you haven't seen a new authorization of use of military force. Instead, you've seen kind of previous authorization expanded in all sorts of ways that appear to be stretches of the imagination. ISIS equals Al-Qaeda, therefore you can go fight it, as does kind of any other violent non-state actor that might possibly perhaps be put into that bucket. North Korea can in no way be put in that. This requires a serious conversation among the American people in a way that arguably the United States hasn't had since 9/11. And it's crucial that we do so, because if this occurs, it will require some serious buy-in by the American people.
Thank you, Mara. Scott?
Yeah, just to point on the Japan-Korea relationship. I mean, my job as an analyst, I'm supposed to be neutral and not provide any comments on my values or anything like that. But the Japanese-Korean relationship, as fraught as it is, it makes me crazy and sad that the two countries cannot do better together.
We need to put that one aside.
The historical. Oh, okay. So from an economic perspective, certainly the countries, demographically, in terms of their economic development pathway, there are so many similarities, and they're facing so many similar problems. Not only North Korea, but also aging and loss of competitiveness, loss of manufacturing industries, things like that. So. Definitely, I had hoped that the North Korea crisis would be a catalyst for pulling the two countries together, and I think it has to a certain extent, but still a lot to work through.
A couple quick points on this. Number one, it's been a while since I've been out of government for a bit, so I haven't seen the NEO plans for a while, but NEO planning used to have a critical role for Japan, actually, in any operation. But as others rightly point out, in this particular scenario, it's very likely that Japan would be equally under threat from any North Korean retaliation. So I think that's a big question out there. On the broader topic of what role Japan can play, I would just make a couple points. Your point on the constitutional limitations, particularly if this is not a defensive action, but an offensive action by the United States, in which Japan doesn't feel like it can make a case for its ability to take part. That could potentially, I'm not an expert on sort of the U.S.-Japan piece of the alliance here, but that could provide some pretty difficult operational questions. The intelligence sharing relationship between the U.S. and Japan, particularly when it comes to theater air defenses, is really important. There is also a number of different ways in which Japanese territory would be really essential to, we have a number of troops that are stationed in Japan as well that would be closely involved in any conflict that would be undertaken on the Korean Peninsula. My assumption has been that the Abe government would find a way to make a case that it could do these things. But I think that there is a real question there about how far they would be willing to go and what that might look like. And certainly if they were limited, I think it would pose real challenges for the United States and its ability to conduct any of those operations. On the broader piece, I would just say that I come away hearing all of these folks feeling even more depressed than I already am about the possibility of this scenario. What I do think is sort of tying back to the first conversation and thinking about the Trump-Kim summit, assuming it happens. I've been down the diplomatic path with the North Koreans before. I'm not one to have a whole lot of optimism for where this goes, but what I do think we really need to do is that given that this appears to be the path we are on, we need to find a way to mitigate the downside risks of this. What happens on the back end? As we heard earlier, after a summit, there is no runway left. You don't really have anywhere to go on the diplomatic track. And does that just leave you in free fall towards conflict? We need to find a way to make sure that doesn't happen. Because if that's the case, and especially if, as I mentioned earlier, this is something, if failure of talks is blamed on the United States, it's the worst of all possible outcomes. And so where I think we really do need to be putting a lot of thought, is into how do we make sure that whatever happens at that summit allows for some continued runway here that doesn't immediately put us into a really devastating conflict.
I guess a final comment would really be that I hope that as much attention goes to the consequences of military action as to the planning for military action. I think that the role of China, which has been alluded to today a couple of times, hasn't gotten as much attention as it should have, because it's very unclear, at least to me, what the Chinese will do and how they see turmoil on the North Korean peninsula and the Korean peninsula, and what they would do about it and where they would come in. And just a final point that is of interest to anyone on the humanitarian front, and that is something an additional. In nuclear talks, humanitarian aid is always brought out and enormous quantities of it provided as sort of sealing the deal or part of the deal. And not enough attention is paid how this aid is used. And I really would hope that there would be some attention to reaching out to the North Korean population, if that's the case, with the aid, rather than just handing it over to the North Koreans, who then use it to really carry out their own policies, which cause a lot of hardship in their country. The aid is often given to privileged groups, or different parts of the country are privileged. There's so much discriminatory treatment of the aid that I don't think the United States ought to be giving aid in that way. I think it can go along with the denuclearization, but really there ought to be access, monitoring, information about it, and some sort of attention to its being connected to some kind of sustainable development in North Korea.
Thank you. I want to thank my panelists. You've done a tremendous service, not just to those of us in the room, but those that will watch this presentation via the internet, in grounding future discussion about military options in the practical realities of the humanitarian situation, the military consequences, the economic effects, as well as the strategic effects. So thank you all.